I will kick off with just a little bit of what we've seen about creative participation, but just by way of intro, really. Wanted to say that often as an agency, we talk a lot about live arts attendance, whether it's theatres, galleries, museums, or wherever. And we spend a lot of time talking about attendance and or online engagement. But of course, we absolutely believe that actively participating in arts and culture is equally, if not more important, in terms of a way of engaging in culture. So it's really nice for us to have this chance to talk about that, because often we end up having conversations about other things. Hopefully this will give a bit of an insight into some of that. Partly because throughout the Cultural Participation Monitor, we've been asking questions, yes, about attendance, yes, about digital, yes, about attitudes and different key topics, but we have also been asking about people's participation activity as well. So this is really the first chance we've got to share some of that. So the first thing I would say really is that creative participation across the general population is, broadly speaking, I would say, looking at these numbers, is pretty high. We've highlighted here things that people said they had done in the 12 months before COVID. And although you might typically see sort of any arts attendance in terms of in-person activity being sort of mid to high 70s, 80%-ish of the population having done something, I think actually in terms of active engagement, these figures are pretty strong. So getting on for half the population, doing one of the bottom highlighted red activities on this chart here on the right. So actively doing painting, crafts, music, writing things, photography, film, digital making, or whatever. Really kind of broad range of activities, all of which have between roughly 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 of the population doing them. And that strikes me as actually, really quite substantial in terms of engagement. We have put a few comparators in here for other things people do. So, DIYs getting on 40%, gardening, maybe that's sort of just over a third. But nonetheless, we're still in the territory of really very popular activities. Typically, people talk about fishing as being incredibly popular as a sort of individual sport. And you can see here that actually all of these different types of arts activity are coming in slightly higher than that. The top two on this list, reading for pleasure, visiting a library, we've included in some places, but generally when we try and give a summary statistics, we're taking those out because they're not quite the same type of active arts engagement, if you like. But broadly speaking, what we're saying is quite a large chunk of the population typically engage in these activities. But, and this might be the sort of, if you like, the first counterintuitive thing, those levels, we think, in terms of breadth of the population, actually went down rather than up during the pandemic. So, although it's true that for some groups, there may have been greater breadth of engagement, or indeed some activities, or some people may well have been doing more, and we'll come on to that. In terms of the overall breadth of the population doing creative things, it did slightly contract. But I guess that's worth bearing in mind the overall context of very large numbers of people becoming busier, becoming less affluent, just becoming, frankly, less energized, lower levels of well-being, etc. So all of those factors are pushing in on a kind of population level to counteract sort of localized bursts of enthusiasm or opportunity. So we do see a sort of an overall contraction in the in levels of who's engaging. If we look at this for people engaging before COVID or at any point during COVID, split out by art form, we can see that actually these are pretty flat, really, with the exception of a few obvious things. So visiting libraries has absolutely collapsed because, of course, lots of time you simply couldn't. Activities that tended to be more outside the home, obviously they're more likely to drop. And reading, although there was a good burst of engagement which really helped publishers, that's more about the same people reading more than overall expansion of reading. So that's dropped a bit as well. So yeah, we saw most things sort of fairly steady away, except where there are obvious instances where they might go outside the home. It is worth noting these aren't directly comparable time periods. The second one is longer. but that probably doesn't make too much difference, because by the time you're not doing an activity across a whole year, you're relatively unlikely to then suddenly start doing it in this sort of month 13, 14, 15, whatever. Where we did see a change within the pandemic, so between 2020 and 2021, really it was relatively flat, but we did see some difference in increased engagement, particularly outside the home, amongst younger people. So that seems to suggest that where people were more allowed to go out and do things, it's really younger groups who are the ones who are quickest to respond to that, particularly under 35s-ish, or maybe under 45s. I don't want to overemphasize these figures, partly because we're talking about differences of percentages where there's also a margin of error in play. But nonetheless, you can see an overall pattern. The green blob, broadly speaking, is the younger ages and around certain kind of types of activity. Okay, now I mentioned the idea of things, if you like, the number of people doing engagement contracting, but potentially people doing more, and that's what this chart is showing. So the figures in blue on the left-hand side are people doing it more. The grey figures are about the same. The red figures are people doing it less. So of course we can see for things like visiting a library, people are more likely to be doing it less than more. But broadly speaking, for most activities, people who did the activity, which is who's included here, are more likely to be doing it more than less. So for example, if you look at the top, 44% of people who did crafts, painting, sculpture, etc., were doing it more than usual. Only 11% doing it less. So there is a sense of this sort of the narrower group of people are doing a greater levels of activity. Relatively few people doing it for the first time. So, well, we've not put the exact percentages on here, but it's sort of 6 to 7% of people doing an activity were doing it for the first time across a wide range of things. Now, clearly, that could still amount to very large numbers of people if you're talking about 1 in 5 of the population doing an activity. But the emphasis is very much on the same people, but doing it at a much higher level. The other thing I would also flag, and this is in some ways is so often true of engagement figures, is that grey band in the middle, people who sort of, whatever the external circumstances, kind of a steady away with doing stuff about the way they always did, is in most cases, but not all, the highest single category. And that's because people's engagement patterns are actually pretty robust to external shocks. People do the things they like them for a reason, they've arranged their life around doing them, whatever, and people will tend to carry on the same course, barring deflections. So in fact, when we see these relatively large proportions of people doing it more, that is quite a significant shift in terms of engagement, even if that is not always the majority. So yes, they are. So that's the thing about engagement levels are genuinely increasing. This is something we sort of found curious as a picture, which is when you look at who's doing the engaging, and this is about sort of I think general levels of engagement in these activities during COVID. What we're seeing is that younger people are very much more likely to be doing things. That's partly linked to opportunity, but it's also linked to just higher levels of engagement even pre-COVID. And broadly speaking, what we're seeing is for most activities, there is a kind of clear downward rake. So from relatively higher engagement earlier to relatively lower engagement in later life. Clearly, some art forms are going to do that to a stronger extent than others. So there's the digital engagement has a slightly stronger kick as it goes downwards. But also notably, I think a few of them, they're heading downwards, but they hold up a little bit better in middle age than they do when you get to kind of slightly later middle age. And looking sort of under the bonnet of the data, so to speak, we can see that that's really linked to families. So what seems to happen is that when people have young children, they themselves are relatively more likely to be doing creative activities up until the children being sort of secondary school age, really, at which point that tapers off. Now, we know from other work that engagement in person tends to be suppressed below the age of about 4 of your children and then go up. So probably there's a little bit of a switchover thing going on there as well. But certainly it seems to be that family engagement is holding that up. And again, there might be some interesting questions to ask about what can be done to encourage engagement in lots of these activities right through the age spectrum. So just to summarise, creative activities are really widespread, and were pre-COVID, continued to be during COVID, albeit a slightly kind of narrower part of the population. Engagement overall increased in terms of those who were doing activities, and where there were increases year on year within COVID, it was mainly younger people that were driving that. But overall, we can see a few different factors that really impact on engagement with creative activities. So age is a really big one that we just mentioned, but also families in general. So we see that family engagement by people with families is higher for every category apart from reading for pleasure, which is kind of an interesting differentiator. But also some other factors seem to be linked quite strongly to higher levels of creative engagement as well. Interestingly, being or defining yourself as neurodivergent was very strongly linked, particularly for digital activities, but actually across the board. And although we at first thought that might just be because people who identify that way tend to be much younger, and they skew younger, but it's such a strong effect, it's stronger than the effect of age, so we think that really is a thing. London, on the other hand, people in London have a higher engagement level, but then London is younger, so we think that's probably as much to do with age as anything else. But also, kind of intriguingly, the one category that really sticks out, certainly in this set of data, in terms of the gender of respondents, is that female respondents were more likely to say that they did visual arts and crafts and sculpture and so forth, but also more likely to say that they were doing it more than previously. So that's kind of intriguing. So it does seem that there's a bit of a sort of gendered skew there. So that's it from me in terms of initial summary. We can obviously, if you have questions, a question from Jennifer. So it's from bits of the data referring to different time periods. The wave one information where it's listed was the fieldwork was done in October 2020, but generally speaking, that's used for the 12-month period before COVID, so March 19 to March 20. Then the other data, wave 6, was collected in March this year, but unless I've specified, well, hopefully I have specified that some of it is referring to specific years like 2020 and 2021, and other sets of data is referring to at any point since March 2020. So that anything which says sort of during COVID, that's what it's saying. It's basically that 2-year period. Yes, they are. So that's a quick overview from me. We'll hear a couple of reflections on that, and also really welcome your reflections as well in a second. So unless anyone has any immediate questions, I will move on, and hopefully this is going to work. There's a video, which always feels high risk in the presentation, but let's hear from Barbara from Making Music, and her thoughts on what we've shared.
Making Music is the UK Association for Leisure Time Music Groups. So that's choirs, choral societies, community choirs, ukulele groups, amateur orchestras, brass bands, jazz ensembles, folk groups, everything that people might want to play together in a group in their leisure time. Leisure time might sound a little bit American, but what it describes is that this is an activity that people undertake as a hobby. So that's what we've settled on, and we support our members, of which we have over 3,900 groups across the UK. We support them with practical services. We have an insurance scheme. We give them template contracts and guidance on how to cope with everything from GDPR to safeguarding, and artistic opportunities. We have a long-running project called Adopt a Music Creator, which pairs one of our music groups with music creator. We connect them to each other. So over the last 2 years, we've been doing literally hundreds of Zoom meetings on different topics. And then finally, we're the voice of the sector because we're the largest organisation in the leisure time music sector, and so we speak on behalf of groups, for instance, during COVID times to DCMS, etc., on issues that affect the sector. Well, so one of the things is that I really had the impression that people engaged more with music during COVID, so that literally there were a lot of people forced to stay at home who decided this is the moment when I am going to learn the trumpet, and obviously lots of music teachers switched to Zoom, and certainly what I've heard from the music manufacturing industry is that they sold a lot of instruments during lockdown. So I was expecting your figures to show more of an increase. I guess what wasn't a surprise was that once things opened up again, that the younger people left home sooner, because we certainly became aware from our groups where a lot of participants, 2/3 of participants probably have are over 50. We do know that they're very fearful. Even after the vaccination program started, they were still very worried about leaving the house and meeting up again in a group. So that does not surprise us at all. And hang on, let me just look at your figures again. There's lots of interesting stuff in there. Yeah, no, I think those are the main things, but also we did find that there was a great increase in an older age group engaging with digital skills that they hadn't had before. So that was a really interesting thing, and we think that the motivator for that wasn't necessarily the art form, but the social connection that these music groups provide. So we did 3 surveys of our members during COVID times, in March 2020, September 2020, and March 21. And so what we found, and was borne out by others, for instance, in the Republic of Ireland, was that the longer that activity was forbidden, the harder it became for people to then come back together. There was somehow the fear built up the longer the break was. Whereas, so for instance, in Scotland, Wales, and the Republic of Ireland, where activity was pretty much forbidden for 2 years, you know, they are still dealing with issues there. Whereas in England, where activity on and off was permitted with restrictions, there seem to be a lot more groups have returned to activity.
Okay, great. So just a sort of a different perspective there from making music. I think some of that reflection about, you know, what it is that brings people back, you know, is it fear? Is it maybe breaking of habits? What it is that's causing those issues? We've got a sort of a few facts and figures about making music here for those who are interested. Again, we'll share all of these slides later on in the community, so you can access those. But one thing that stood out for me from their research was they asked a question to all of their music groups, which was about what's the meaning of suspending activity for your group, as referenced in Barbara's comments, but again shown here in this kind of, you know, word cloud, is just the importance of social activity as a kind of driver, sort of particularly out of the home creative activity. Anyhow, I'm now just going to pass over to Carly to give another perspective in terms of these figures. So Carly, if you're there.
Hello everyone, I'm a white woman in my mid-30s. I have brown wavy hair and I'm wearing a black t-shirt. It's lovely to join you all this afternoon. Yeah, I found that correlation between engagement by age and seeing that peak when people have families as being really interesting. And the fact that although not entirely surprising that we see this decline in engagement as people get older. And similarly to Barbara, I know anecdotally from speaking to groups and housing associations with older residents that a large proportion of people are cautious about returning, or as we've just looked at, you know, that there are a number of reasons why people aren't engaging in cultural activity in the same way. And therefore, thinking about how we perhaps need to reconsider ways of mobilising people's access to cultural opportunities. There's been some interesting work and research coming from CARDA, the Creative Ageing Development Agency, to celebrate and champion the cultural contribution of older people, and reframe what art for and with older people can look like. And it was fascinating actually to hear Barbara's observations about many older people engaging with digital learning, and the motivator for that as being social interactivity. The Festival of Ageing are doing some interesting work, and their website offers a valuable resource page where you can upload activities happening both on and offline. So retaining that hybrid offer and still thinking about those people who are looking for that, those remote opportunities. However, what that particular graph around engagement by age got me thinking about, particularly those two findings around families and older people's engagement, was opportunities for cross-generational practice and cultural engagement that brings families and older people together in the same space. So I thought I'd just focus on a specific piece of practice that I've come across that I found really interesting. There's a brilliant article by Alice Booth from Lancaster Arts, who asked the question, how can we facilitate conditions where single older people feel welcome at participatory activities alongside families? So just thinking about that loss of social link that Ollie finished on there. So this article came from when an older male colleague of Alice's said, for me, the trouble with family work is that I'm not invited. And of course, not everything can be for everyone. But at Lancaster Arts, they began to question how they could make inclusive invitations to both families and adults that provided a genuine shared experience. And as a result, they embarked on a research project to explore the key conditions that might contribute to a meaningful intergenerational experience. And they concluded a couple of key points around ensuring that rules are set so people kind of know how they can engage in that space, making sure that both adults and children's contributions are valued, but this idea of connection. So they found that enabling adults, parents and their children to be really in the moment with each other as part of a creative experience as being something that was really powerful. And I just think that's something really interesting to consider looking at all this data, particularly thinking about how we continue to rebuild access and opportunities, and crucially those social opportunities within communities. So yeah, it really made me question, how can we create equitable experiences that provide a sense of togetherness for different members of the community? So that article has led to a partnership project between Lancaster Arts and Z Arts called Hand in Hand, and I believe they're doing the R&D at the minute, so it'll be really interesting to see what findings come out of that. Other elements of the data I found interesting, but I suppose not surprising, is that finding about young people being quick to return to activities outside of the home, and also thinking about people who, neurodivergent people's participation, and how that we've seen such an increase in people participating digitally, and how we can continue or continually evolve these activities and be thinking about how different people in the community have benefited from different digital offers. But yeah, fascinating. Thank you, Ollie.
Wow. Well, thanks, Carly, for those thoughts. I'd be really interested to hear thoughts from other people here as well. There's just one comment from John in the chat, which might be worth me sort of highlighting, sort of spoken out loud for those that haven't got the chat open, saying that the correlation between age and participation looks interesting. You know, you might have thought it would go the other way in terms of younger people being busy with children and families. I think that's probably putting pressure on them slightly more towards the middle age range. But yes, there's maybe a bit of that. Certainly the case with classical music and choral singing, which I'm involved with. So post-COVID, you can see engagement rates of older people dropping, as mentioned. Yes. And that engagement with older people, I think, is a really interesting challenge as we look forward, in terms of to what extent and in what ways and in what circumstances will older participants come back, and what do we need to do in order to make that feel safe for people.